from Shabbos Parshas by Yikra, Parshas Zocher. It's a mimer which is both deals with issues of the Parsha of the week, Parshas by Yikra, and Purim. Usually, a lot of Vayikra Mamorim are later on. They're already comes out in Nisan time and so on, close to Nisan. But since the Shana Muberes, we have Vayikra Maimer, and both our Maimer is Vayikra, and because that's our Kviyas also. Okay. Sajbis Melech Bris Halakecha, it says in our Parsha, amongst all the things about the Karbonis, is that a person should not make stop, should not have ceased. That salt, which is a covenant with Hashem, a promise to Hashem, should never be removed, should never stop. In other words, when we're makir the Karbonis, we should always have salt on the Karbonis. Horrible, but the Torah, it's explained in the Torah, Melech, Mamtekes Sabos. It flavors, the expression is sweetens, but it means it flavors the meat. Though salt on its own has no flavor, in other words, you can't sit down and eat a spoonful of salt. Still in all, it affects and causes flavor in something else. So it itself is like tasteless, for lack of a better term, but it affects taste in something else. Continues to explain in similar vein, there's also this level, the level of Toidam that's likened to salt, that it itself has no flavor, but it flavors something else. What part of the Toidam has no flavor but flavors something else? That's the level of the inner part of the Toidam. Why is it called without flavor? The idea of Torah itself, the Pnimius HaTorah, the inner part of the Torah, is something that's hidden and concealed. It's not totally comprehended in the reasons fashion, like we have a comprehension, a reason, and the reveals part of Torah. Despite the fact that it doesn't have the same flavor, the same gishmak, the same tastiness as the revealed part of Torah, it flavors, it affects the meat. What is the meat of the Torah? That's the study of the revealed part of the Torah. How does it flavor the revealed part of the Torah? Sin through the studying of the inner part of the Torah. One comes to fear sin. When the fear of Hashem, that is his treasure, as the pasuk says, Azai ha-Torah Hashem. So then it ensures that the Torah that he studies is Hashem's Torah. So that is the benefit of this idea of the salting of the meat. The idea of studying the inner part of the Torah, though, and people complain about this. They say, I just can't wrap my head around these things like Atzilus and Oidus and Caleb. And because of that, it has no flavor, it has no geschmack, it has no taste to it. But specifically engaging in the inner part of the Torah, by this, the person comes to flavor the nigla part of the Torah, to have a geschmack in the revealed part of the Torah, meaning to have the idea of the Yiras Hashem and so on. So now the Rebbe goes on and says, nice base, that mimer is known, that mimer and the beer on the mimer, the famous thing, beer L'Sadris Melech, is a classic that Siddim learned when we first started learning Mamorim. One of the classic Mamorim that we learn is the beer on this mimer in Likutei Torah that speaks about each part of Torah's particular advantage. The advantage of the study of the revealed part of Torah versus the advantage of the study of the hidden part. In the continuation of the mimer of Torah, the beer on Torah Niglas as an introduction to explaining the advantage. in being involved in the revealed part of the Torah. Mevayer explains, the Torah is the Hashem's wisdom that's not Atzilus. In Atzilus is enclosed the infinite life by Mamish, and that is the advantage, and that is what we're gaining when we learn the revealed part of the Torah. Even in the revealed part of the Torah, we make part of us, we ingest, like food, like eating meat. We ingest within us the Oyer Ein Sof that's in the Chacham Atzilus that we are comprehending. Now, we know the Torah is filled with notes and comments of the Tzemach Tzedek. Primarily, those are the pieces that you see in the parentheses part of the Torah. In Torah, it's not really that common, but in the Torah, it's throughout the Torah we have the parentheses. These are comments, notes, elaborations of the Tzemach Tzedek. Rebbe says, this particular statement, that when a person is studying Nigel, he is comprehending and taking in the inner, the Ein Sof that's enclosed in Chachmei Elohim. So some Tzedek explains, therefore, it's called the early metaphor or analogy. Kadmaini seems to indicate it's an analogy, it's something that comes from early on. But Chassidus explains it, it's a mashal for the Kadmaini. Meaning, the Torah itself that we're studying in Nigla, that's Hashem's Chachma. That the Chachma is a vessel, a container, to the infinite light of Hashem, that He is the one that is the first and precedes the world. So mashal hakadmoini means a keli, just like a mashal is a keli for a nimshal, just like the metaphor is a vessel, a container that gives us the idea that's enclosed in the metaphor. The same thing, the nigla of Torah, the chachma ilah, that is a keli, a mashal for the Oyer Ein Sof, meaning Hashem, which is kadmoini shaloylam. That's the meaning of the phrase that it says in the pasuk that the Torah is called mashal hakadmoini, mishal hakadmoini. And the Tzedek includes in this a note, which is that Tzedek often says, "Stian such and such a mimer about this," and he includes that over here as well. Like it says about this in the mimer of Pur. That is the quote of the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Rebbe is going to analyze many details over here of the Tzemach Tzedek. First of all, when you understand in a mashal, the idea of a mashal, a metaphor, an analogy, is really includes in it two opposites, two extremes. On the other hand, it's a vessel, a container for the idea that's being explained through the mashal. The thing that you are explaining, the idea that you are explaining, is enclosed in that metaphor. But on the other hand, the idea is not the thing that it's being. The idea is not the thing that it's being likened to. So when I give a mashal, let's say, to be able to understand the 10 spheres, and I give you a mashal from the 10 koiches by a person. That doesn't mean that the 10 koiches by a person is Hashem's 10 spheres above. True, they came down by chain descent, but it's not the same. Or we use an animal as a mashal for our nefesh bahamis. Yet after all said and done, an animal walks around on 4 legs, lives in the field, and a nefesh bahamis lives in our body. And that's physical, that's spiritual. It's only a mashal. It's the mashal, the nimshal are two distinct and separate things. Say them as even more so, Shuhu Mailim al Hanimshal. The mashal, even though it contains in it and it hides in it, the metaphor hides in it the idea that it's explaining. The idea that the even though the mashal contains in it the idea that it's explaining, it also covers it. Like the language of the Torah in the above mentioned Maimer of Purim that the Tzemach Tzedek points to, that the mashal is totally of a different nature, and it's not at all anything of the nimshal. Shemaylim ala nimshal. So when you start talking about the person's asking you what's enough Shabbat, so you start describing to him what a cow is like. So he says, I don't know what you're talking about. You're talking about cows. I'm talking about a person's soul. What are you putting, these two different things together? In other words, the mashal on its own, before explanation, before you elaborate, it's completely foreign, and it conceals the topic that you're trying to explain. So now, getting back to our issue, since in the Maimon look at the Torah, it wants to speak about how great Torah is. It wants to say how wonderful and special it is to learn the revealed part of Torah. That in the revealed part of Torah is enclosed the infinite light of Hashem Mamish. Ain't a moving, it's not understood. What does he add by saying Torah Nikras Mishalak Admoina? Torah is called a mashal for the early one, for the Torah itself. Hari Adra, but just the opposite. Inyan a mashal moira ala helam al nimshal. When we talk about a mashal, we talk about a metaphor that indicates that that item that you're explaining is being concealed. In other words, over here you're concealing the early one of the world, meaning you're concealing Hashem. That seems to be a negative. You want to talk about the positive of the revealed part of the Torah, and here you're telling me a negative. It's a mashal, it's a covering, it's a concealment of Kadmoina Shalom. Rebbe says, this will be understood by first prefacing an explanation in what we said before, that the mashal conceals the nimshal. That in a certain aspect, it's even a greater concealment than a concealment that a riddle has. A riddle is also indicating some deep concept, but it's in a very riddle type of fashion. So they share a common thing. There's some concealment that is supposed to be a means of revelation of something else. It says, mashal in some ways is more concealing than a riddle. People might think the other way around. A riddle, you say a riddle, it doesn't make any sense. The riddle, by its very nature, usually is a nonsensical putting together of things until you explain what the riddle means. You say, aha. So the riddle is nonsensical. The mashal, on the other hand, is something that is logical. You're explaining the biology of an animal. On the other hand, the very fact that the riddle is nonsensical, that already gives you an inkling that there's something deep. It says in the last line, the kivin shachida since the riddle itself, without what the riddle is pointing to, top of the second page, it has no intellectual content to it. Not only doesn't it have any intellectual content, it's even something that's contradictory to intellect. So, for example, it says that Shimshon posed to the Plishtim, he posted riddles. One of the riddles is, he says, I want you to explain to me how from the mighty sweet can come out. In the end, he was referring to a specific situation where there was a carcass of a dead lion, and in it there was like a honeycomb, etc. But the very nature of the riddle is something that's the very wording of the riddle makes no sense unless you know the solution to it. From this itself is understood. The very fact that the riddle has no sense to it whatsoever, so it's understood. So we realize that the riddle is a hint for something that's concealed. As opposed to an analogy, a metaphor, even without what we are trying to explain, it has some type of content to it. It could be, therefore, that when you're hearing a metaphor, you don't even realize at all that there's something that it's hinting at. A riddle teases you. A riddle makes your mind work and say, there's got to be something to this. A mashal doesn't do that. Sefer Mishlei. Mishlei is from the word mashal. Mishlei Shloim. Shloim said Mishalim. We read one of the Mishalim of Shloim every Friday night. Sounds very logical. Woman of valor, she does this, she does that, the treasurer of her family, so on and so forth. All completely valid, all completely correct, all completely logical. If you're not interested in looking further, you'll just take it at face value and that's it. But we know that Shlomo Melech is not just talking different stories about a wife. Rather, as the rest of Mishlei is, Perek Lamed Aleph and Eishes Chayil is a mashal. It's a metaphor. True, it's a correct metaphor. That is actually what a wife does in the physical realm. But Shlomo Melech is not praising the wife. He's out to explain what Eishes Chayil is a metaphor to. It's a metaphor for Shabbos, it's a metaphor for Torah, it's a metaphor for Malchus Tzilus, as different Nefarshim and different Svarim talk about. But the very fact that in a mashal you can make a mistake and think that that's all it is, it's just a mashal and there's nothing deeper behind it, whereas in a riddle, you know, because it makes no sense, that there must be something deeper. So in a way, in a certain aspect, the Rebbe says, the mashal is a greater concealment, because you can read the mashal, as many do, let's say every Friday night, they read Eishes Chayil, and they have no clue that we're talking about something very deep. Whereas when Shimshon says, Ma'az Yetze Masik, when he said from the mighty comes out sweet, everybody understood. He was saying something over here, but he didn't understand what. So therefore comes out that the mashal is something that is a greater concealment than a riddle. Now the Rebbe says, he contrasts it with what it says in other places. Before we go there, let's open up to any questions. Let's continue. We're left off by the brackets on towards the top of the page, fourth line. Higher into note. Sometimes it's explained. That the mashal, the metaphor, conceals the nimshal less than the concealment of the riddle. In other words, the Rebbe says here in our Maimer, we're saying that the mashal, the metaphor, is a much more powerful concealment, and the riddle is a less of a concealment. Why? Because the riddle teases us and makes us think that there's something deeper. Whereas the mashal fools us into thinking that that's all it is. But in other places it says that the mashal is less of a concealment than a riddle. How do we fit that in? So it says it depends when. So he says, "Avol zeu rak la'achrei sheyodim ka'mashal yesh lo nimshal." When do we say that the mashal is less of a concealment? When you know that there is an idea behind it. Then, through a mashal, through the metaphor, through the analogy, it's easier to reach the point that he's trying to say than through a riddle. So if a person goes, let's say, to read H's Chayil, and he knows right away this is a mashal, it's much easier for the person to figure out what this is a mashal about, what the mashal is teaching us. Whereas when you're dealing with a riddle, even though you're going right into it, knowing that this is a riddle showing on something deeper, it's not as easy to be able to solve a riddle as it is to reach the conclusion of something that the mashal is showing. That is, if you're going in knowing that it's a mashal. It's possible to be a situation that one thinks that the mashal is all there is. Like we said before, he thinks H.S. Chayil is talking about his wife, and that's it. Without knowing that there's also a nimshal, there's a deeper idea over here, a deeper message that's being communicated. Because of that, therefore, the mashal is considered a greater concealment than a riddle. Okay, once we've established that a mashal is a very powerful concealment, how does this explain what the Tzemach Tzedek says that this the reason why Torah, the revealed part of Torah, is called Mishalach Admai? Now he says after the brackets, the Indians are Shaykh Lamavur the Torah Sham. This matter is connected to what's explained over there in the Torah Achilus, Ben Eischa Torah Nigels, the difference between being involved in the revealed part of the Torah, Limud Halachas HaTorah, the study of the halachas of the Torah, Jodam Aloymid Masiv V'Toifis Mehus V'Atzmis HaChachmas Shabbalach, the person that's studying comprehends and grasps the very essence of the Chachma of the Halach, which is how Nigla is different than Chassidus. Because Chassidus is something that is, you can't grasp the very nature of spirits or neshamas or Oris and Kalim or spiritual world. But the halachas of the Torah, yes. He knows the actual Chachma. Why does he know the actual Chachma? The Alter Rebbe explains over there in that Maimer, because the halacha is talking about physical matters that you know what they are. You know what an ox is, and you know what a cow is. You know what a talus is. You know what a house is, and you know what a rishus harabim is. These are physical matters. Therefore, when I'm understanding the halacha, I have the actual chachma grasped in my mind of that halacha. Versus when I'm studying the inner part of the Torah, the limud chachmas Kabbalah versus the study of Kabbalah, Valderach Limud Haggadah Sipurei Torah, in a similar vein, studying the different stories in the Gemara or different Sipurim in Torah Shebeksav, different stories in the Torah. Halachas HaTorah Shemul Bashim B'Seichel. That those stories and those matters of Kabbalah are things that are mysterious to me. So what's the difference between the two? Those halachas of the Torah that's enclosed in intellect, it's similar to a mashal. What is a mashal? A mashal is that you can understand it very well, and you could fool yourself into thinking that that's all there is to it. There's nothing deeper. Because of the way a halacha of Torah is enclosed in our mind, in our intellect, in Chachma, One can make a mistake, have a forbidden thing, that there's only the external part, the body of the Torah. It's called the nigla is called the bodies of the Torah. The gufa, the nishmasa, the value of the body of the soul. In a similar vein, there is the Torah that has the body, which is the bodies of the Torah. In other words, the halachas of the Torah. Not nishmasa, but then there's the soul of the Torah, the ihi ikra, the kula, eraisa mamish. That is the core of everything. That's mamish, the Torah. So therefore, a person could fool himself and think that the body is all there is, that the chachma is all there is. There's nothing more than this, the sense that the nigla makes. So therefore, it's a mashal that really hides in it the Torah itself. In truth, when I'm learning Torah, I'm not just ingesting intellectually the ideas of Chachmei Law, but I'm also taking in the Torah itself that's hidden like a nimshal in the mashal, the Torah itself that is behind these halachas in the Torah. That mistake, that concealment is only a possibility by Mishal HaKadmoini, by the mashal part of Torah, by the revealed part of the Torah, by Guf V'Dorais. She'en Kasset Puravagot as opposed to the stories and the different stories that are brought on Chazal, that gathered to Akim, Shalom Nislapshu B'Herois, since they were not enclosed in directives. In other words, there's no halachas involved. Do this, don't do that. Things that we could wrap our mind around. Is del pirish lashon Torah v'inyan Torah. The idea of directives, that is the explanation of that's the meaning of the word Torah. And not only is that the translation of the word Torah, but it's the whole idea of Torah. So the fact that you have parts of Torah that don't seem to be doing what Torah is about, they don't seem to be hayra, they don't seem to be telling me what I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to live. That itself triggers our mind to say, like the riddle, there must be something deeper. We see about it, they must be hinting at the secrets of the Torah, dugmas achida, similar to a riddle. And that is why it's called Mishal HaKadmoini V'Lachein. So the Rebbe concludes, yet Weimar, and therefore, Shazoi Kabbalah Tzemach Tzedek Masha Kosi. This is the intention of the Tzemach Tzedek in what he wrote. V'Lachein Nikra Torah Mishal HaKadmoini Chulu Shukli Learners of Baruch Hu. Therefore, the Torah is called the mashal of the early one, because he's a vessel. The chachma that he's understanding in the Torah is a vessel to the infinite light of Hashem. Shegam helem hamashal tzrichim l'shanoisoi v'lifol shiyekli. Also, the concealment of the vessel, one needs to change it and to effect that it should become a vessel. Instead of being a concealment, a vessel is a container with which we serve, with which we give something out. How do we make even the nigla of the Torah to be felt as not just a concealment that we can't even tell the Torah itself is inside, but rather it's a vessel for bringing forth the Torah itself? That is through a study of the salt of the Torah, through the study of the inner part of the Torah that's called salt. Also the mashal, which is the revealed part of the Torah, Baruch Hu becomes a vessel for the infinite light of Hashem. So the Rebbe concludes, and to add, the Torah Sham Bas Chol Sasif Medubar Oides Inyan Amasiris Nefesh. Actually, let's stop over here. Any questions?
So